concept of the blind tasting for today is, how do you blind taste different villages, vintage, and stages of maturation? And you guys are all collectors and serious Bordeaux wine drinkers. So you come at it with a different perspective and a more educated perspective than a typical person would that may not be collecting or has the extensive experience tasting different Bordeaux wines. So hopefully you will find this like not too difficult, but maybe it will be challenging. I'm not sure. So it'll be kind of fun to hear. What I do want to keep it kind of light and hear your opinions as we're moving out through the blind tasting, to kind of keep it kind of interactive. It would be fun for me too. Okay, so the concept, like, again, you guys know this, but just to formalize it, because the first 6 wines, what we're going to be doing is blind tasting on stages of maturation. So you guys have 2 lists. The lists 1 through 6 are the wines, but not in this order. This is just by vintage. So we've mixed up the first 6 wines, and so what we're going to do is just talk quickly about how do you approach from a blind tasting, from the MW perspective, when I'm blind tasting, how do I assess maturation? And then we're going to do a part 2, a little bit different for the second 6 wines. So it's kind of a 2-part program here. So, and again, you guys as cellar masters yourselves of your own cellar, you know, feel free to chime in. And these are years taken from more specific towards Bordeaux versus just general, but you may disagree, and I think we can all agree that there is some variation here. It's difficult to say a wine too young or youthful is only 1 to 5 years. That may not be 100% true all the time. And that's another part of the conversation we're going to have in a little bit. Like, why? What makes vintages more, some vintages more age-worthy and take 20 years to even start to show that they show age at all? You know, and that's part of the second part of the conversation. So if it's too young, youthful, what does it show in the glass? And you guys can chime in if you agree or you want to add something to that. These are kind of general things taken from my experience and from Jancis Robinson and wherever else I went. So too young, youthful, fruit-driven, vivacious, yet not yet complex. Oak and tannins seem to stand out and are not yet integrated. Pretty accurate? Right. Simple. All right. Closed or dumb phase. I've heard both terms. We've used both terms.
Or shut down.
Shut down would be another way to say it. Thank you. So you lose aromas without gaining bouquet.
What does that mean?
That means it's muted. You're not getting, it doesn't have the evolution of the bottle bouquet yet, but it also isn't showing fruit-driven, oaky flavors. It's kind of like, and Lynn said, shut down, dumb, or closed. And this is an interesting period. I mean, a few months to years, I think it really truly varies on the wine. I mean, you hear a lot of wines described as kind of in their teenage years where they're going through some growth changes, and that's kind of what we're referring to. Well, awkwardness. Yeah.
And then there are wines that'll open and then close for some years and then open again.
Like they just are.
They're playing with us.
Yeah. You're ready. Wait, no, not quite. Peak, 15 to 40 years. It's hard again to specify because vintages, quality, it all varies. So what is that? How can we define that when a wine's at peak? The bouquet is fully developed without decay. Astringency is receded.
What do you mean fully without decay?
So it's opened. The complexities have developed, but yet it's not showing the souring characteristics, the complete deadening of fruit. So there's life there. It's open without decay. Because the decaying process, right, the flavors tire and stale, essentially. So you've got basically maximum potential that wine's going to get from an aromatic perspective. And a complexity perspective, too. Integrated mouthfeel. This is also very important, especially blind tasting and trying to discern, you know, where is this wine at? And it can be misleading. It's very difficult to blind taste older wines from different vintages because of all the compounding variables. There's so many factors that affect how a wine ages, and it's literally quote from several resources. I wrote it down. I was like, this is great. That The changes from secondary to tertiary flavors, and we'll talk about that in just a second, change by a pathway not yet understood into what is termed bottle bouquet. They do not understand the science of wine evolution, period. They, as in the foremost chemist and wine professionals, still have not pinpointed the complexities of how wine ages and why. So it makes it, on our end, when you're blind, you know what I mean? It's hard to predict because of all the variables, which we could talk about in just a sec, because that's kind of interesting. So if it's too old, peak, integrated mouthfeel, texture, flavors, length, everything's nicely balanced. It's all integrated. It's got a nice texture. Those tannins have softened. Like we said, the astringency has receded. There's flavor, there's freshness. I quickly tasted through these wines, and there were two that stood out for me because they showed age, but yet still had some vibrancy and freshness and integration. So anyway, that'll be interesting later when we talk about that. Too old or past peak, so the tiring of flavors, the deadening of flavors, that's not a good place to be. And sometimes that drinking window is short and the past peak comes quickly. It's really hard to predict. And then acidity as a result of all the chemical changes. Acidity is perceived to dominate because you've lost fruit. The fruit, especially ripe fruit, can add texture or perception of texture on the palate to balance the structural components, your acid and your tannins. So when you've got soft tannins and now you've got no fruit characteristics, what's left in the evolution in an old a wine that's past peak is literally the sour acid characteristics. I'm sure you guys all can relate to this, right? You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Okay. Any questions on that? This is like, what are we defining when we're talking about, as you're blind tasting these wines, part of the exercise is assessing, where are we at? Is this wine too youthful? Is this in a weird phase? Are we at peak, or is this past peak? And this is kind of what I've created to determine, how do we define that? Because we all may come from our own perspectives, but how do we kind of formalize that? So let's keep that in mind as we blind taste in just a moment here. Oh, first of all, any questions thus far before we keep going? No.
I just wanted to point out Jim Finkel, who gave a TED Talk before you got here.
Oh, cool.
One of the things he said, the baggage we sometimes bring to a tasting is his desire not offend. So when you're assessing these wines, if you think some are past peak, do not be afraid to offend.
But yeah, the cork failure, big problem. Storage, how the wine is made. How much oxygen goes into the wine? I mean, the whole conversation about pre-mox in white Burgundies, one of the arguments for pre-mox is the fact the winemaking style nowadays uses a lot of oxygen, and that expedites and speeds up chemical reactions. So how the wine is made. What else? There's many factors. Good. Winery hygiene. Awesome. Quality control.
Amount of time in oak.
Totally. How much time in oak? Absolutely.
Percentage of new oak, first year oak.
Perfect. Yes.
Acidity. Initial acidity.
So what does that relate to? Because that is really a key variable, particularly.
If all the other things are good, the acidity will determine.
But what does acidity relate to in the wine process?
Ripeness.
Structure?
Ripeness, which relates to what?
Which relates to hanging time.
Which relates to what? Just generally.
Sunshine.
The vintage.
The vintage.
Is it a warm vintage, which is the second part of today? A warm vintage, hot vintage, kind of a classic. I call it balanced. That's an informal term I'm using just for today. But, the vintage characteristics absolutely impact how the wine will age. So, we've got so many variables that we've got to weed through. No wonder why people don't, why there's so much importance in scores and people go online to research and, because nobody really knows. It's like really kind of blind leading blind here. Even at the high levels, no one knows. So anyway, unless you have tons of experience, but even still, it's hard to predict this. So what is the systematic approach to assessing the state of maturation? The intensity of the color? Let's connect this to information that's useful. Let's connect these to maturation. What can the color intensity tell you about the maturation state of a wine? That's color, right? So this is a great example of which one's older? Yeah, brick or red or garnet indicates that scene's age. So visually, you can quickly look through these wines, but that's not always 100% accurate because every vintage is different, right? And they age differently. So, but it does indicate there is some evolution happening here. How about the intensity itself?
If it's vibrant, bright, then it's young.
Good,
Likely.
good.
If it's a little bit cloudier, then it's okay.
Yeah, in the intensity, right? If it's still fully intact, you have very little rim variation where the bowl hits the, when you turn your glass on the side over white and you look straight down, the center there is your bowl. As you move your eye to the rim, is there a change, a dramatic change in color, tone, right? Does it lose color, go from pale to deep, notably? Rim variation is a huge indicator of, a potential indicator of how long it's been aged. But for sure, a good visual cue. So the color intensity, also color, the actual color could relate to the grapes used, right? Like Cabernet Sauvignon, well, Merlots as well in Bordeaux, but the actual specific colors can relate to extraction techniques, winemaking, the grape variety chose, so there's a lot of information you can garner from there. And rim variation we just talked about, and then of course sedimentation. What is sedimentation? Like literally, what is it? Yeah. The precipitation of tannins, anthocyanins, basically bond together as a wine ages, and as it bonds together molecularly, it becomes really big and heavy and quite literally falls out of solution. So it's this bonding process of different molecules, anthocyanins, the color, and polyphenolics, tannins, and basically you see this anthocyanin phenolic combination of color and tannin, and that's why you lose tannin and color. And that is a reflection, and you can see that in the sedimentation of the wine. But that's literally what has happened from a chemical perspective.
So in an unfiltered wine, we often, you know, in young wines that are unfiltered, we'll often find sedimentation, but not in a filtered wine. As a filtered wine ages, that molecular bonding still happens.
Oh, yes.
A filtered wine will show sedimentation eventually.
Yes, they all will. The sedimentation in a young wine is excess tartaric acid. It's tartaric acid crystals that have fallen out of the solution. Like when you open up and you see on the cap there's little like shards. Yeah, that's just excess acidity. That's not the same sedimentation process as this. This is over time.
So it has nothing to do with the alcohol and fermentation. I mean, because that's already happened.
That's already happened.
Sometimes I've heard people say that the sedimentation in unfiltered wine, particularly a young unfiltered wine, is a byproduct of the fermentation.
I don't know. I feel like this is like I have to think it through sort of answer, because I feel like it's one of those rabbit holers.
As a lecturer, we want you to.
No think. We don't have time to think. But let me marinate on that one, Lynn. It's gonna trickle in the back of my mind.
The question on that with the sediment is, generally speaking, with the red wine, is a sediment, if there's sediment present, not on the cap cork, sediment.
Yes.
Is that essentially pulling out density of color or pigmentation,
Yes.
if you will?
Pigmentations. Anthocyanins are the color. It's the chemical term for what gives the wine color. It's the term is called yes, it's pigmentation. Just looking at the wines, you could look quickly and see, and again, gather information just from appearance. So cruising on, so this is kind of where I think it really helps. Where am I at with the aging process? I think this is really useful. Youthful primary and secondary flavors is a youthful wine. You're going to find mainly fruit, floral characteristics, And then your winemaking or secondary characteristics is the term for oak and winemaking processes. So your spicy notes, your nutty notes, your chocolate, spices like baking spices, espresso, vanilla, nutmeg, if it's a white ginger, etc. So chocolate, almond, walnuts, espresso, those sort of flavor characteristics are from the winemaking, specifically oak. So in its youth, you're going to be hovering between primary, secondary. As the wine evolves, it's going to shift to secondary, tertiary. And that's where, you know, who knows when that moment's going to happen and how well it's going to go. And then finally, you're shifting from tertiary to bottle bouquet, where it's really, you're here when it's at peak. But this is a good sign that the wine is probably at least 10 years old to 15 years old, is you're picking up a lot of tertiary notes. And you'll find that, as you know, in most older Bordeaux wines. And then the pinnacle being bottle bouquet, which you try and research, nobody's got a definition. So the definition is complex, difficult to describe aromas. Okay? No, literally, there is no definition for bottle bouquet. It literally is complexity. It's these flavors that are so interesting, but very hard to define. Yes, so again, keeping this in mind, on the palate, what happens to our tannins? How integrated are the tannins? Are they soft at this point, or are they still young and astringent and chewy? So this is like firm, chewy, astringent, grippy versus velvety, plush, soft, fine grain. Where are the tannins at relates to how old the wine is.
In which direction?
So in its youth, you're going to generally find more chewiness, grip, and as it evolves and shifts, you're going to find more of a softer texture. Now, this again, looking at vintages, we may have some confusion here when we get to tasting in just a second, because sometimes a younger vintage versus an older vintage, the older vintage shows more chewy astringentness, and it never evolves, right? So you're tasting, oh God, this still has a lot of tannins, and it's 30 years old. Sometimes those are hard vintages where the tannins truly never evolved, and that is a problem. And there are some vintages here that have that problem, so hopefully we can figure it out when we get there. So flavor, integration, concentration, complexity. So what is dominant here? Is it primary, secondary, tertiary? Has all the fruit dried up, leaving acid, possible tannin if it's a hard, cold vintage or a difficult vintage? Also helps you kind of determine where are we at in the evolution or the maturation state of the wine. How's the acidity? Is it balanced? Is it like one of the wines here had such beautiful freshness, yet had bottle bouquet and still had fruit characteristics? To me, that was a really sweet spot. I'm not going to reveal which one, but there is a favorite in these first 6 that I found that really, like, to me, shows that this wine is in a good place and evolving well for my palate. Now, everyone is slightly different, right? You may not agree with that. Yeah.
Question. If the tannins remain predominant after 30 years, for example, is that indicative of a low quality wine?
Well, it just depends, right? What are the other components? Is it just tannins, but yet there's still a lot of flavor concentration? Or is it just tannins and all you're getting is this angular sour component? So that's the real question, because there are great wines that are 30 years old, still with massive tannins, but also with the other components to balance that. So that's where the consideration of balance is very important when you're assessing how is this wine evolving. Does that make sense? And then body, right? Is it thin, watery, angular? Kind of relates to, you know, acidity, body, alcohol. These are all together relating to balance. I try to break them out just to give you guys some terms to play with. But how does this feel? And this also can relate to vintage characteristics. Cooler vintages versus warmer vintages. Warmer vintages, you get more alcohol, you get more opulence, body. There's more of an extracted characteristics oftentimes. And in lighter, thinner vintages, you can notice that as well. So this is very connected to alcohol and ripeness of fruit. Will impact how the perception of your body is going to feel. Okay. So, are there questions on this? Are we going too fast, or are we doing okay? This is review. Good. I figured. So, an example of something that's evolving. A youthful evolving wine would show ruby color with garnet highlights, moderate rim variation, primary fruit notes combined with integrated secondary notes, cedar, allspice, and tertiary, right? It's evolving, so it's showing all categories. Highly extracted plush mouthfeel with high levels of fine-grained tannins and high alcohol points to a wine that's drinking well now due to its forward flavors and bouquet, but will age another 6 to 8 years due to high-level complexity and opulence. This is one of my Master of Wine notes. This is the sort of stuff they expect you to write on the exam. So this is kind of an example, and I thought it kind of tied everything together that we've talked about. How do you describe an evolving wine? How do you describe a wine in relation to its state of maturation using evidence, right? And that's the idea here, is the evidence, the color, evidence, the rim variation, evidence, the flavor characteristics, primary, secondary, tertiary, evidence. How does the mouth feel? Evidence. What about the tannins, alcohol? So you're using your observations from the glass to put your argument together of what state you think this maturation of this wine could be. All right, so without further ado, put the first 6 wines in order from oldest to youngest and comment on their state of maturation using what we just talked about. Comment on their...
Don't move them from the mat.
Don't move them from the mat.
Decide, write down.
In your mind. You can just, under here, list the number. So if you think this third 1990s number 1, put that as number 1 and just write it on this paper. Do or write it right on the mat. Even better. But here's the thing. I want to call on you guys and have you share your answers. So, and when you share your answers, I want you to defend it with evidence in the glass. Talk about the flavors. Talk about the tannins. Talk about the texture. Don't be like, because I think. You know, that's not good enough.
No swag, just age.
Boom. And remember, your neighbor could be wrong. I always hear people try and cheat blind tasting and then their neighbor's wrong, but they're like doubting this. So don't listen to anyone but yourself.
Can you be my neighbor?
You can be my neighbor. I'll be your neighbor. Richard, absolutely. You seem like a fun neighbor. Let's chat. Let's have a chat. Okay, who feels confident that they have them in more or less the pretty close to correct answers? All right. I love this guy. All right, let's go. Well, wait. He wants to talk. What's your name? What's your name?
Eric. I'm Eric.
Eric. Okay, Eric.
Stand up, Eric.
What you got? And here's what I want you to say. I want you to say which ones you think they are, and then quickly why.
Well, I really just was focused on color, and then I try to back it up.
Okay, so go ahead.
I was focused on color, and then I try to back it up with nose, and
Good.
then I went into taste.
Okay.
So really the emphasis was on color, and I try to study them closely. And you just never know with these things. But here, do I say the numbers? Yeah.
Go for it.
So number 1, I believe, is the 1990. And number 2 is 1975. Number 3, 1996. Number 4, 1982. Number 5 and 6 are the 1998s. The first one being Saint Domingue, and the second one being Palate.
Interesting.
It's a try.
I only agree with one of your choices.
Okay. So apart from color, does anyone have we'll do this. He did an argument for color. Who wants to do an argument for wines 1 through 6 based on the aromatics? I like this idea. Thank you for introducing that concept. Go ahead.
Aromatics, I would say number 1 tastes, it smells the oldest to me.
But what does that mean based on what we talked about? Primary, secondary, tertiary, bottle bouquet, fruity, lack of fruit. Like, give me info, observations.
I thought the 4 was the oldest.
Well, let him go.
It certainly has more tertiaries
Okay.
going on.
So you thought number 1 was 75?
That would be my guess.
Okay.
I thought number 1 was 75 because I thought the tannins were very soft.
Okay, good.
I thought the acids were high. And Granted, I haven't been very good at my acid guessing, but the tannins were very soft, and therefore I said 75 or 66.
Okay, so we're moving to palate. Good. So you went 75 for the nose, a number 1. The palate you said for 75 you thought was also number 1.
Yes.
And I just picked color because
And color.
of all the tertiary aromas.
Good. Okay. How about a number 2 argument for nose, aromatics, or palate?
I thought number 4 was the 75 because I got a lot more mushroom and tree bark in there, I thought.
Yeah, I just go for the Worcestershire scale, whatever, then once it just tastes like Worcestershire, stuff like it. That's what I mean.
That's specific.
And more or less quality.
Nice.
That's right.
I could have gotten you the answers.
Same here, I thought 4 was 75. Yeah.
Okay. And why did you think 4 was the 75?
75 was kind of an odd year, and there were a lot of wines that never really came together.
Okay.
This one, I think, has. Actually, it's one of the better 75s that I've had. Correct about which one it is. It's good producer. It's consistent with glass. And it just kind of has the 75 color.
Okay.
And that's typical of other 75 colors.
Okay.
So, I don't know how you want to do it, but
Go
would it
ahead.
be possible for you to sort of like start with number 1?
Yes,
and
let's do
work
that.
your way and
Sure.
tell us what you think about the
Yes.
color, what you think about.
Let's do that.
Yeah.
Do you want me to state the answer first and then
Yes.
tell you what I think?
Yes.
Yes.
Number 1 glass is the 1990. Very good.
Very good. That's very good. Pre-arranged machine.
Yep. The Perrier machine.
Nice.
I wrote down shows primary, secondary, and tertiary flavors. So it shows there's still fruit, there's still winemaking, but definitely shows a lot of tertiary notes. Plush, it's very open. There's a presence. There's some bottle bouquet, obviously. On the palate, I wrote plush texture, tannin-wise. They were pretty soft at this point. And the acidity was nice and juicy and fresh. So I felt the evolution of this wine was pretty good. However, compared with the other wines that are older, you go, okay, well, I don't know how well that aged because there's some older wines here that are even more fresh than this one. And in a blind, I can see why people called it 75 because the tannins have kind of fallen out. And, but it did have it still had life to it, but it was not the most, anyway, it still had life. So number 2 was the 1982. No? Good job.
That was my favorite wine.
Me too. Me too.
Thank you, Eris. That's the wine Eris.
It was delicious. To me, it was the favorite one on the palate. It still had so much life and juiciness. Like the acidity was there, but there was also fruit characteristic. So it wasn't just sour. Like it really was a lively structure. The color I think looking at these wines, a few of them look like 1 and 4 almost look identical. So I can understand why people put number 1 as 75. But number 2 I thought was the winner because it showed it's alive, it has the characteristics, it's showing evolution, but you can also go, I think this has some more life left in it. So from a quality standpoint, I think this is really showing nicely. Yeah, go ahead.
Looking at the list, there are variations always, but
Of course.
the best year was the 82, and I thought it was the best wine.
Yeah.
That's what we would expect, all other factors being equal.
That's a good point, and that's the next part of the class is about vintages. This one's just like, hey, let's get the hang of how do you identify and talk about wines as they're maturing. But next part, we do actual vintages. Okay, number 3, Chateau Palmer. Now, what about those tannins? That had a powerful tannin structure. And the vintage 96 was in fact known for its powerful tannin structure. And so this was aligned with that assessment. And it didn't have the softness and the flesh of a couple of the other wines with the fruit aspect. Like you can feel it was a structured vintage. It really was, yeah, a mouthful. Number 4 was your 1975. Good job. And I think your assessment was spot on. Nice. And I wrote, this is an example of a wine to me that's peak to slightly going, it's going this way. It's still good, and to his point, I think it's showing okay, but it's definitely on the decline. And there's still some tannins that I felt were unresolved. So I felt like, for me, considering the age, you could still feel this, like, compared with 90, for example, where the tannins were so evolved. Like the 75 still had some chewiness, and I was thinking, okay, it's still got power. Is this going to be one of those wines where it dies off and you're left with just tannins that never resolve? And that kind of, to me, this example was in my mind, I'm like, I don't think these tannins will ever resolve. Because they're still quite, to me, marked considering compared with the others, yeah.
So these are the 2 wines that I struggled with most because 82.
Which numbers?
Number 2 and number 4.
2 and 4?
Because I wasn't sure which way to go.
Yeah.
75 or 82. But as I look at them again, the tone and hue, just from color, you've got more rust in the 82 than you would think it would be the opposite. So how did you do that?
There's clarity in wine number 2 is much better.
There is no clear explanation because, as we've stated, there's so many variables that affect how a wine ages, when it ages, when it's at its peak, what chemical reactions occur, and how and why. It's a crapshoot. To follow up what Robin's answer is where I do not put, when I'm blind tasting, I do not put most of my emphasis on color because it's not, the most accurate assessment is your nose and your palate. That my approach when I'm blinding, I go, okay, all right, because I know some vintages age faster than others. So going on appearance alone is not a true indicator of the age. Or different qualities. Also, some can brown out faster than others, depending on the quality or the grape variety. Like there's too many compounding variables. Granted, we're in Bordeaux only, but I would suggest moving forward, go nose, palate, then use your color as your supporting evidence. But it shouldn't be where, oh, this color, therefore it's that. That's because you're going to find yourself. It worked for a lot of the wines for you, I'm surprised, but that's not my technique. I put most of my energy on the nose and the palate, especially the palate, yeah.
If you didn't know about the vintage, the vintage information, what are the distinguishing features between 1 and 4 for you? You're just smelling those?
Well, the tannin difference was huge for me. 4 still had, considering, 4 to me had, was this. Flavors starting to become tired. It wasn't really an acidity dominates, but the lack of flavors also made you kind of feel like tannins out when they shouldn't. Where wine 1, those tannins to me were really evolved and very soft. So it was a very different mouthfeel. And also aromatically, number 1 was a little it wasn't as. Here, I think it was more like towards its peak, at its peak, or like less down the end of its life. That's where I went with the 2.
Also, what's
Yeah.
kind of interesting about the 75 Beau Séjour, wine number 4 on our map, it was from a Magnum.
Ah.
So maybe we should have told you that, but now you know.
No, it's good.
These are great wines. I'm proud of these wines. However, wine number 4, I was kind of, getting rid of it on you guys. We do consider it to be definitely past its peak, even in the mags. But it's fun. It's fun to taste.
We wanted it for education. Now you kind of have a concept. What is that like compared with others that are? All right, moving along. 5 and 6. Number 5 is the 98 Pichon Longueville, and number 6. Oh, the Baron, excuse me. And the number 6 was the Canon.
Yes,
The Saint Emilion.
I got those two right.
Okay. So what do you guys think of the 98s? I think you can see the vintage. These are still youthful, tannic styles. These are not, this is not a fleshy wine. Neither are these, I don't think. Yeah, but I thought to me, number 6 had a little bit more flesh and softness on the palate, but it was also right bank, right? It's Merlot based. And that Pauillac, really right bank, left bank, that's another variable you have to consider when you're blind tasting, right? What is the main grape? Cabernet naturally has more tannins and more acidity than Merlot is more body and textural. And I feel like these two next to each other really show that point, I thought, well.
Are you saying 6 is the Pauillac?
No, it's the Saint Emilion. It's the rounder one.
Also, we are, just a quick note, keep this in the back of your mind. Wine 5 and 6, 1998, left bank, right bank. At lunch, we are doing 2 more 1998 wines. One from the left bank, one from the right bank. Okay. Smith Lafitte on the left bank. It's not wines, I'm telling you. Smith Lafitte and Clos Fortin for lunch. So that'll be it. We'll continue investigating.
Totally, great. Say that louder. I think you're spot on with that call. Robin.
Because we talked all about how that's the most blizzard vintage of all time, and our lifetime, 98, where the right banks were so great, and then it started to rain, and the Cabernet didn't turn out.
Yeah, and you feel it.
Yeah, I said this tastes like tomato juice. I always get tomato juice in bad vintage.
Number 5?
Yeah, in bad vintage.
A tomato leafy note. Okay, so flight 2. The next 6 wines, now we're talking about vintages. So let's talk quickly, because we don't have time, really. This is the one education slide. And then I'm going to let you guys have it. So vintage variation. In a cool vintage, you get unevenness. Otherwise known as classic vintages is a really nice way of saying this is going to be kind of a hard wine. It's going to be a little angular, there's going to be some acidity, it's going to be a little lighter, it's probably not going to age. Classic, it's a very generous term. But you could say cooler, uneven. I threw in balanced because there is this sort of place where it's not a bad vintage, but it's not an exceptional vintage. So I consider that kind of a balanced vintage, and there are a couple in this lineup that would fall under that good to very good sort of tier. And then your warm vintage, which apparently warm vintages, 9s, 5s, etc., are pretty known for being excellent or very excellent quality. And again, this is all based on history when, in Bordeaux, it was very difficult to ripen, especially in the left bank. Now, climate change and there's some evolutions in the viticultural techniques. They're able to make better wines now, even in lesser vintages. So this is kind of watered down a little bit, but historically warm vintages meant excellent because we actually ripened our fruit this year. So, I mean, let's, and you can see in the tasting notes and the critics that they still kind of adhere to this, and I would argue it's not 100% the reality, because you can make great wines in off vintages, and that's something for you guys to debate, and you could talk at length and have different opinions, and nobody's right or wrong. So basically, when you're blind tasting vintage, you're looking at the structure is going to be very important in the flavors. So is it more of a tart, sour, fruit characteristics, or ripe, jammy, baked, or dried? Now, the trick is you're considering these vintage, but you also have maturation to factor in as well. So the blind tasting process isn't like, oh, well, it's got these tart fruits, it's a cool vintage. No, because it could also be an older wine that's not aging well, or just an older wine in general. So there's many layers that we're going to be doing. We did the first part about maturation. Keep that in mind as we're doing the second part on vintage, because you can get a cool vintage, but it could also mean it's an older wine, right? So you got to factor in both as you're tasting. Acidity. In a cooler vintage, it's more tart, racy, sour. In a warmer vintage, it's softer. So how is that going to be perceived as more full, softer? Fat is another flavor. It's a textural a description. So your palate is where you, honestly, your palate's where I spend most of my time. That's where the most information comes. So cooler vintage, warmer. Body, similar, lean, light, fat, full. Alcohol. Tannins, just so we're all on the same page. Tannins, hard. So sometimes you can get light tannins that are low, but they're still astringent, which is kind of a weird combination, but happens in wines, especially in cooler vintages where the tannins didn't have the chance to fully evolve. So you get this hardness, so like in really warm vintages or like classic California Napa California Cabernet. There's tannin, but they're really velvety and round. It's the same concept. So take that idea and apply that to a warm vintage Bordeaux where you get tannins. There's a lot of tannins, but they're not angular or sharp or astringent. Where in a cooler vintage, you can get less tannins, but they have that more astringent characteristic.
They seem more apparent.
They seem more apparent. Good point. Good descriptor. So the tannins are very indicative also, like very important to consider when talking about the vintage and also the age. That's why this is not an exact science blind tasting, especially older wines from different vintages. Because what else do we have to think about, you guys? Actually, we're going to do that second. No, we don't have time. I'm going to just give it to you all now. I had a two-part thing going, but we're just going to roll through it. Well, here's a little exercise. Which vintage type do these published notes from Jancis Robinson and Decanter.com describe?
3. One is a 3.
Oh, right.
Easy. Good.
Then the other one has to be a 4.
Nailed it! Who said that? Right there for the win. Yeah. So we're going to come right back to this. Here's what I was going to have you guys taste them all, determine what the vintage is. And I still want you to do that. But before you do that, I'm going to just give it to you all now because we don't have time to do the two-part. When you're blind tasting like this, you have to consider the vintage. You have to consider the state of maturation. You have to consider, is the wine from left bank or right bank, which means is it Cabernet or Merlot dominant? Because that is another variable in this whole thing. So Cabernet, higher acidity, higher tannins, leaner mouthfeel. That's why they blend with Merlot. It adds body. More aromatic, particularly black fruit, cedar, tobacco, bell pepper. These are simple. Merlot, more alcohol body, lower acidity, more red fruits in cooler vintages. If you're finding red fruits, could be Merlot. Think about that. Plums and blackberries in warmer vintages. So that's another variable. That's 3 things we're thinking about. The 4th thing is the villages, right? Oh, shoot. So, yikes. So really, here, I'll go just to the end. We're doing maturation, vintage, grape, and village to come up with the answers. Sorry, I know you guys are taking pictures. So left bank, because we have all these, I think all of these villages are represented, I believe. Am I right? Are they? Or I just copied and pasted my notes.
Oh, but not Pomerol. Pomerol is not.
It was. We got rid of Pomerol. So Saint Austere, known to be austere, particularly in the youth, but with potential to age, deep colored but more acid than the more southerly appellations. Pauillac, concentrated, quintessential Cabernet. Black currant with that black currant cedar cigar box flavor profile. Tobacco leaf. Makes naturally deeply colored and powerful structured wines with tannin, ample tannin, dusty cocoa-like tannin. Saint Julien, deeply colored but not as concentrated as Pauillac. It's a marriage of dark fruit and slight floral notes cue to Saint Julien. Chocolate-covered cherry. You can also hear them describe Saint Julien as very high quality, ripely fruited, especially in good vintages. It's the most California stylistically. Margaux, look for stereotypical floral perfume, if not on nose, sometimes shown through the palate, that is more elegant, silky, softer tannins sometimes. You may even think this could be a right bank, but the flavor profile and other elements need to direct you back. The acidity needs to direct you back to Cabernet in the left bank. Feminine and perfumed. And then Pessac Léognan, mineral, smoke, warm brick with a clove note on the finish. Kind of more rustic to me, Pessac. What?
What is warm brick?
Like in the sun, a brick, like the heat that you would get like at a fire, like not a fireplace, but a warm. I don't know. You gotta smell a warm brick, and then we'll talk. How do you describe that? It's a warm brick. How can you describe what it smells? It smells like warm brick. Well, you can imagine licking it because it's strong.
All you have to do is touch it. And if it's warm, you know it's warm brick.
Exactly. So right bank, Saint Emilion. This is your Merlot. Ranges from not so special, green and tart fruit, to highly concentrated. And look for oak. Right bank has a tendency, you can, like the oak sometimes can stand out. Because especially in really warm years, you get a lot of oak treatment, lavish oak treatment I notice in the right bank wines. Lower acid, softer tannin than left bank. Pomeroy, we don't have one today, but you're looking at that silky, plump silky texture. Search for Merlot, broad, sweeter fruit, lower tannins, walnut, prunes, truffles are classic markers, but we don't have one. And then if it's not quite hitting the quality tier, it could have been a Côte de Bordeaux. This is kind of a quality differentiation. Likely Merlot, but it's not special, but perhaps typical Bordeaux, earthy, coarser tannin texture would suggest a lower quality. So I know it's a lot and we're going quick, but.
And everybody will have access to her PowerPoint, don't worry. I'll send you all a link to that.
Yeah, she has it on PDF. Just send them that. So I want to keep these vintages out to help you guys. So you can leave these out while you're tasting. And I want you to see if you can come up with which vintage is which. Is it right bank or left bank? Let's just do that. That seems like enough to do. I would love you to. Okay, Vicky's got the floor. Go for it, girl. Let's hear it.
Try to identify the 15. I think it's number 9. Who else?
What?
Yes.
What?
Number 9.
Number 9.
Do you guys think that is the youngest wine, number 15? And defend your answer.
Oh my gosh, so much oak.
Good.
So much fruit.
Good.
So much oak.
Good.
The tannins, though, are beautiful, right? They've already, they're not so overwhelming, so unless there's grape in it, 15 is.
Awesome. Round, ripe. And there's definitely, I wrote down whole cluster likely. You know that trend now where they're doing a lot more whole cluster? I get that lift, that floral, fruity perfume lift. And that is the trend. I feel like this is a representation of what you're seeing coming out of young Bordeaux, young Bordeaux's wines right now. In Napa too. No, what number did you say was it? 9. Yes, it's number 9. She's right. Let's do that. Let's do popcorn style. Yeah. Let's go.
Uneven ripening, I think number 12 was very green in the nose.
It was green.
Yes, very green.
I got that too. So you thought the cost was number 12. Anyone have a different answer? For 12.
We were down to 10 and 12, and we thought one was the cost and one was the beige fill.
Okay.
Right? And then
Close in
looking
vintage.
at the color, right? 12 looks just a little bit older.
Okay.
And I have to give full credit to Carl on 10. He's like, 10's got to be the cost. The tannin is ripping my face off.
It does still
And
have,
so,
yeah.
I mean, for us, we basically came down to the last two, right?
I mean, 9 was the really obvious one for us.
Yeah,
You're
yeah.
going too far here.
Yeah, but
We only asked you about 12.
all right, but that was how we got 12.
Okay, your time's up. Thank you. Who has an answer for number 7, the first wine? Let's start there. Who's got an answer for number 7?
Number 7.
Lynn?
Ooh, well, I got dry tannins on that.
It was powerful.
I thought it was, what?
I agree. I thought it had tannin.
Tannins, but I did think the fruit was tasty.
Good.
And that's-
Overpowering.
Overpowering, better way to say it, Robin. Overpowering tannins, but delicious fruit. So I'm going to hand it off to someone else to, just because I'm so democratic.
Is 2009?
No.
2004.
Okay, he got the right answer. Why did you call it 04?
Well, similar reasons, and I also do that.
It's the 04.
Because it's out of balance. Because it's out of balance.
Because it's out of balance.
Well, using this.
Using this. Uneven.
But I
Good.
still think it's delicious.
Number 4 is the Kos. I mean, number 7 is the Kos. 04. Yeah, please.
You know, on the palate, Kos can be very, very structured, very tannic,
Oh, yeah.
very long lived. And on top of out of balance, I found that in the wine, you know, very, very tight, very heavy, you know, tight tannins.
Awesome.
Very tannic set.
Yeah.
Did you give
Just
one
classic.
star?
So his argument was also weaving in the village argument and not just the vintage argument. Thank you. Good job. You up-leveled the class. Him for the win. What was your name?
Jim.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, how about number 8? Who's got an answer? Who feels honestly kind of confident? Okay, Jim for the win again. Let's go.
03, the 03 Saint-Emilion.
Okay, not the win.
Okay.
But that's okay. Why did you call it that? Because
What did he call?
say it again.
I thought it was the 03, Montbousquet.
And why did you think that?
Because it was very, very fruity, very forward.
Agreed.
I thought a little bit broken down, maybe, you know, from the too much heat of that vintage.
Round tannin.
Very round, and a little bit, honestly, at this point, by negative implication because of the remainder. What was left of the remainder? But I thought the remaining ones.
So what would, from this list, what other wine could also show a forward style?
Right bank from 05.
9. Yeah, it's 9.
So number 8 was the 9. And I felt like number 8 really showed the vintage character. It was a forward vintage, but yet still had some structure, but it was really fruity. Yes, is that why did you call 9? 8, 9.
5 and 9. Those were very good vintages.
Yeah.
I don't know what's better, exceptional or superb. Superb, I guess. Very good vintage. I collected a lot of good tonight. I feel good.
Good job. But I think you guys, you've identified warm vintages. How can you tell? You mentioned both 5 and 9, forward, fruity. Yeah, and you can see there is a trend to that. 3 as well. 3, 5, and 9 are warm vintages. Okay, so how about number 10? We've got 2 left. 10 and 11. Also both warm vintages. Did everyone else call 10 2003? Is this unanimous? Does anyone want to, let's debate this. Jammy? What's cool is both 10 and 11 are from the right bank. So they're both Merlot dominant, which kind of eliminates variables. They're both from a warmer vintage. So characteristic-wise, I felt number 3 I wrote down more advanced than expected, which would, a warmer vintage.
Wait, number 3.
I mean number 11. And number 11 I felt like was more advanced than I expected it to show. And number 10 was also very open, but to me, this is my marker for Saint-Emilion. This wine hits it. Soft, plushy power, anchor of tannin. I get that with high quality Saint Emilion, it's like you're not expecting that on the finish you're going to be slapped with tannin, because on the mid palate it's kind of plump and round, but on the finish is really where, to me, that is my huge marker for versus Pomeroy, which is kind of more silky and layered throughout. So if you can get to the right bank, it's a good marker. So I felt like this was open, it was round, but yet had this kind of, I wrote down anchor of tannin. It was quite powerful, and I thought still could evolve for sure.
Number 10.
So number 10 is what? Oh, 05 is the Liburnet. Number 10. Number 11 is the 2003 Montbusquet.
Number 10 is the Montbusquet.
Number 10 is the number 10 is the 05 Saint Emilion. Number 11 is the Montbusquet.
No, 05 is not, it's a Liburnet.
No, it said Saint Emilion on the label when I poured it.
Oh, so they wrote here Liburnet.
I know. But I was like, anyway, right bank.
They're both sentimental.
Okay, let's lead through it, one more time. Lindsay is going to read the wine.
Okay, I'm going to read it.
9, 10, 11, 12.
Okay, just so it's clear. Number 7 is the 04. The Coast, yes. Number 8, Domaine de Chevalier. 2009. Number 9 is the 2015. Number 10 is the 2005. Virginie. Number 11, Montbusquet, 2003. Number 12, 2000, Bechevel. Très bien? It's hard, because you're doing 4 things at the same time to do an answer.
I could do this all day long.
Good.
I agree with Eric Lacey. I could do this all day long. This was so much fun.
Good. Good. Yay.